Hey everyone, Arbor617 here. I was just waiting for Blender 2.8 to come out before making this tutorial, but since it's still not out now, I'm just going to make this tutorial anyway. So let's get started. I'm going to bring open Blender. I'm making this video about a whole bunch of different tips, tricks, and shortcuts, and stuff that'll help your animation in Blender a little better. As I was mentioning, I was going to make this for Blender 2.8, but I've been waiting so long for it, I'm like, let me just make it now, make it kind of casual. Hopefully this will help you out. There's nothing really kind of artistic in this. I'm not showing you how to, become a better animator or how to make better materials or something. This is more just kind of usability of Blender overall, based on the kind of years I've been doing it. So we got a lot to cover. Let's just get started right now. For the first section, I'm going to be talking about kind of the general interface and usability. So for my very first tip is the most important tip, I would say, as far as just overall improving your ability to use Blender, is to customize the input to better benefit what you do. What I mean by that is under here, if you go to File, User Preferences, and in the Input tab, all of the things can be changed. The buttons you press to open up the viewport, or the to do this command or this command. And I know it's kind of an instinct just to kind of leave these things alone, but if you really get in here and start finding the operations you do frequently and setting them to something that actually works better for you, you can really just overall increase the speed at which you work. And I know this is the number one tip I have. However, I'm actually going to be coming back to this tip at the very end of the video because it's such a long kind of thing to explain, and I want to get through a lot of these other tips first. So just know that that's my number one tip, and we'll get back to that at the end of this video. My next tip is one that many people will know. I've explained a lot in my other tutorial videos, but I'll explain it again here just in case, is that if you right-click something and have something selected and you want to move it somewhere else in the scene, simply left-click on the place to move the pivot, do Shift-S, and move selection to cursor, and it brings it to where you need. This is especially helpful if you have, a massive scene and you have a cube way down here and you want to get it way up here. You just click up there, Shift-S, move it to cursor, that easy. And of course you can look at all these other Shift-S options, such as the moving the actual cursor to the selected and whatnot. These can also be very useful. Also, I figured worth mentioning now is that if you're kind of falling behind on the exact hotkeys I'm using, you can see them down here in the lower left. A lot of these tips in this video are going to be about hotkeys, so keep an eye on that. My next tip is about the camera. If you press Shift-F to fly around, you know that you can hold Shift to speed up, and all these keys that we've probably talked about before. You probably figured this out. But many people don't know that if you scroll upwards on the scroll wheel, you can actually speed up the overall speed at which the camera moves, and if you scroll down, you can slow it down. So you can get really precise, slow movements, and this still continues to work with the shift to speed up and slow down. This is really helpful if you have a really large scene and you need to kind of quickly fly around. If you press the shift spacebar while hovering over a certain viewport, it will actually maximize that viewport. So let's say we're doing something right here and I want to just look at all the keyframes for this character. I'm just trying to clean up some keyframes. Just shift spacebar and you can just kind of look at that and use that for a moment, and shift spacebar to get back out of it. If you have something in the scene, such as this cube, and maybe you want to do some work with this cube, but you don't want to see everything else, if you press numpad/, it will hide everything else but that one object. Now you can go in here and easily edit things without having to worry about having the whole scene cause performance. I find this specifically handy if I want to, let's say, put some interesting material on it, and then go into the, if I want to go into the rendered mode. Now you don't have to worry about rendering anything else in the scene, so you can really quickly check to see if your material looks good. And then when you're done, just go back numpad/ again to get back out of it. If you press the first letter in some of these menu options, it will jump straight to that option. What I mean by that is, let's say I want to change this to the node editor. If I click on this and then press N, it'll take me to the node editor. If I click on this and press D, it takes me to the Dopesheet, etc. This is handy for a whole lot of things. Pretty much any of these menu drop downs have these kind of options. Although the ones like modifiers where there's a bunch of options, obviously it doesn't know which one you want, so it just kind of picks one. If you want to set keyframes on something, you can obviously use the normal right-click insert keyframe, or if you simply hover over it and press I, it will insert the keyframe. This becomes especially handy if you have a bunch of things. Let's say you want to keyframe a bunch. Let's say we have all these different carrots. You can press I, and go through and keyframe all the different things. Or if you have auto keyframe turned on and something is in a list like this, you can merely click and drag across them, and that will keyframe all of them at once. You can also type out values and stuff in any of these kind of value inputs. Let's say I want to change the end frame 30 frames longer. You can simply press +30, type out +30, and now we've extended it by 30 extra frames. You can do a bunch of things like you can multiply, you can divide. This is kind of helpful in things like resolution. If you want to just double your resolution, you could just do ×2, or obviously you could have used the 200% in this case, but you can do multiply, divide, add, subtract, all that stuff. If you have your scene divided into different layers, such as all these different layers, and you want to just kind of turn them all on at once without having to go around and click on them all, if you press the tilde key, it will toggle all layers on, and if you press the tilde key again, it will bring it back to how you had it, which is really handy for just quickly previewing what it looks like with all the layers on at once. In the outliner, a few tips about the outliner is one thing I like to always do is change this all scenes to visible layers. That way if we hide a bunch of these different layers, it really clears up the viewport. You can just see what is in the visible layers right now. You can also jump straight to an object you're looking for. If you have it selected in the viewport, hover over the outliner and press numpad period, it'll jump straight to the cube. Also, don't forget there's a search menu. If you know what the object's called but you can't find it, let's say I lost my banana, you can always type in banana and find it. But remember, if you have visible layers on and it's not on that layer, you won't see it appear. You can use the C key to select things. For example, if I have a few different pieces of geometry here and I want to select a few of them, you can press C, and if you scroll in and out, you can change the size of it. You can use that to quickly kind of grab a bunch, which is similar to box selecting. However, one of the big advantages comes if you have something like this plane with a lot of subdivisions, and we want to select a bunch of different faces. You can press C, and you can literally just kind of brush on the faces you want by just clicking and dragging. And if you middle mouse click, it will get rid of things, so you can, find whatever shape you want. If you ever find the pivot point is way off to the side, it's not kind of centered, as you see this pivot point is kind of way down below, it's kind of awkward. If you have something selected and you press Control, Shift, Alt, and C, you can do origin to center of mass. It's a good one now that the center of mass is right in the middle. This becomes handy also if you have some strange geometry, like so, and then you wanted to, spin it around, but it's spinning way around the edge. You want to spin around the middle. Control Shift Alt C, origin to center of mass, and you can either do surface or volume. One of the recent applications for this technique I found handy was in this animation. I wanted to separate out the lamps. So if I select all the lamp parts and I press P to separate it, you'll notice that it doesn't really pivot around the center. If I want to rotate it, it's rotating way around the center. And that's because when you separate objects out, it puts the pivot in the center. But if I do Control Shift Alt C, put it to center of mass, it'll rotate around the middle. Also, I missed a little bit, but whatever. But let's say we want it to actually tip over from the bottom. And this is where this is really handy. If we go to the inside, left click, and now we do Control Shift Alt C. Rather than doing the center of mass, we do origin to 3D cursor, and now it rotates around the bottom. And that's really easy if you want to make something that's like swinging around a certain point. Just literally left click where you want the point to be and do origin to that cursor. Now it'll rotate around that point. A big tip for improving performance. If I press play right now, you'll see we're getting about 9 frames per second, maybe 7, and went down to 6 per second, 6, 7 frames per second, and maybe up to 8. But if we go into the scene settings, go down to simplify, if we turn on simplify, set the subdivision viewport to 0, and now we press play, now you see we're up to 1820 FPS. That was basically doubled our frames per second on a scene which is already pretty laggy because there's tons and tons of rigs. And what that is doing is if we have a character, or it doesn't have to be a character, it could be anything at all, if we have something in our scene that has subdivisions, for example this face has a subsurface modifier on it, and that subsurface modifier controls, how curvy some of these things are. Let me actually turn that back off. So you see how he's got a nice curvy eyebrow, but then if I turn it off, it's sharp. Well, basically what simplify subdivisions does is it takes everything in your scene and says nothing in the scene can have more subdivisions than 0 in the viewport. So everything will look a little sharper, but at the cost of twice the frame rate. It's totally worth it for while you're animating. And of course the render is still set to 6, so it'll still have plenty of subdivisions by the time you render. If you're worried about it anyway, you can still turn it off before you render, but I pretty much always leave simplify on 0 while animating. If I specifically need to see something with some more subdivisions like faces, you can turn it back up to like maybe 1 or 2. As you see, it got a little smoother, but then it'll start lowering the frame rate. So again, for the most part, leave that on at 0 to improve your FPS in scenes. You can set your own viewport presets. For example, if I wanted to hide all the stuff like that so you can only see the render, but I don't want to have to constantly go turn that on or something, you can go up here to when you see where it says default. If you go over the plus button, hold shift and click on that plus, that will create a new little viewport thing. We can name this to something like render only. And then this one we can, hide tabs, go render only. Could even, push that way over. And now we can go back between default, which has all this stuff, and render only. As you can see, it starts getting a lot of them. I usually delete a whole bunch of these by hitting the X button next to all the ones I never really use. Now I've got a default one where I can see this stuff, and I can go to the render only, just to kind of see how things look without having to change it. And finally, for interface stuff, some useful things you can do in this menu over here is, of course, you can change your kind of view, your focal length and stuff in the viewport. Sometimes if you're working on a kind of cluttered scene, you need to actually see like a little more wide so you can really see around what you're doing, or maybe you want to zoom in to get a better cinematic look. As always, you can change the near and far clip plane. I don't know why you'd ever want this really low. It doesn't seem like it really helps performance, but you can clip it slower or clip it closer. Doesn't seem to really help frame rate. Frame rate's just the same either way. I always leave this up at like thousands and thousands. If we go down here, this as always, these things I just showed, only render to hide all the stuff you don't need rendered. You can have relationship lines on. I always have those hidden. I don't like them. You can turn on and off the world background. Sometimes the world background can cause a little bit of lag on slower computers. It could be handy to turn that off. And down here, ambient occlusion. I wouldn't really recommend this too much unless you're just trying to get a little better look for a scene. Maybe you're about ready to render an OpenGL draft out. But you can turn on ambient occlusion, and you can kind of play around with it. So you can have some just subtle shading around the scene without having to actually render anything out. And one of the last things in here is in the background images. If you're working with like some kind of modeling, making a weapon or something, you can add an image, load up an image and have it in the background. I'll load up just a thumbnail for no reason. But then if I'm in the camera, you'll see now that I've got the thing as a background image, and you can bring that to the foreground. You can have it somewhat opaque or have it not opaque at all. So it's an interesting little interesting thing that I use here and there for specific reasons. Moving on to animation, my number one tip about animation related stuff is to only animate using location and rotation and not scale. And what I mean by that is a lot of people like to have this set to location, rotation, scale. That means anytime you like move an arm or something, if I go into animation, we go to the Dopesheet, what it will do, it will create keyframes for all of these different things. If I go over here, we got all the scales keyframed. However, when you're animating characters, you almost never animate the scale of their arm or the scale of their head. You're usually just moving and rotating. So if you leave this on location rotation, let me actually just temporarily delete all these keyframes for a second, and we're going to make some movements. And now you'll see that I only have the movements and the rotations. And if you do a lot of graph editor work, it just helps hide clutter, optimizes your scene, make the scene run faster. Also, if I'd always leave this this button selected, the insertion using active king set only. If I turn that off and I do something like move, let's grab the head again, and I rotate it, now you see it added the scale stuff anyway, but if I turn that on, it will only use the location and the rotation. So mine pretty much always looks like this. And if you want to scale something, you can always just set it back to location, rotation, scale. Or what I do, if there is some rare case where you want to scale something, rather than using, auto keyframe in this, because of how rare it is, just grab like the object, go in the object settings and just manually keyframe the scale, go forward, keyframe the scale to 0, and there you go. You can still scale things without having to have it on auto keyframe and have it location, rotation, scale. So leaving it in location, rotation benefits you overall. It's faster scene, and it'll be easier to use the graph editor, which we'll get to more in just a moment. My next biggest tip is to use the view only selected. If I have that off, it will show all the keyframes for everything in my scene. This is a really big performance thing. It causes a lot of lag if you have all these things shown. Also, it's just a pain to find anything. I don't know why you'd pretty much ever want all this stuff shown, but if I do view only selected, that means if I have, let's say, like the head selected, it'll only show the head bones, or if I press A on my rig to select all the rig bones, I'll just see all the bones, or the keyframes on the bones on my rig, which is a lot easier to work with rather than seeing everything at once. Just to put things in perspective, I pretty much always have that on all the time. I pretty much never turn that thing off. However, with the view only selected on, one thing you might notice right away is that if I have something like this where a character is moving around and I want to start keyframing his head, you can't see any of the keyframes on where his, his pelvis is moving. So you don't know, let's say if you wanted to move his head to kind of go up every time he goes up, down every time he goes down, you kind of just have to guess. But there's a way around that, and if you, let's say if you take this bone down here, and then in the graph editor if you pin it, now that the pelvis is pinned, even if I unselect it, and now I grab the head, now I can actually make a keyframe, and now I made a head keyframe, and I can still see the pelvis keyframes, even though I don't have the pelvis selected, and even though the show only select is on, I can still see the other keyframes. So if you want to have view only selected, but still see certain other keyframes, you can always just pin it and then unpin it when you're done with it. I don't use this very much, but certain cases when creating like walk cycles and run cycles, it can be kind of handy. Although if I'm just doing a walk cycle and run cycle, you don't even need the show only selected on anyway, really. But it's still helpful to know. My next tip is to turn on the ghosting button so you can see the hidden things, the keyframes of hidden objects. And while that's useful is, let's say we have this thing selected and we have it animating to move along, and then we keyframe the visibility to disappear. If I don't have the ghost button turned on, as soon as it disappears, so do all of its keyframes. And now I can't do any animation with it. So if I'm trying to like animate it, that just start getting really annoying. But if I turn on the ghost button, I can still see it, and still kind of, even when it's gone, I can tweak things and move things around. The other time this is very useful is, let's say you have something hidden, and then we have some other thing we're trying to animate, and then we're like, okay, I have all the keyframes selected, right? Let me actually do this. Okay, so I want to move all of these keyframes over, and I only have these keyframes selected. If I accidentally move over here, now I actually move the cube keyframes as well, because they were hidden and selected, but then they became unhidden. Long story short, keep that on pretty much all the time, and then keep this on pretty much all the time. Next up is these filters buttons. Let's say, let's make this a little bigger. We have all these different filters of options we can see. Let's say we have view only selected and ghosting on, but for some strange reason, we can still see the scene settings, because at one point we keyframed the samples. See how we keyframe the samples here? And even though I have view only selected, you can't select the samples, so it thinks it's always selected. But if you don't want to see that, because let's say you don't want to accidentally, grab these keyframes and move those keyframes over, but if you can't get rid of them, then what you can do is go to filters and hide the world settings and the scene settings. That gets rid of those. You don't have to see them anymore, so you won't accidentally move them. This is true if you do something like, let's say we want to keyframe the ambient occlusion strength, go forward a keyframe, lower it down. And again, we can't get rid of them, and we might accidentally grab them and move them. So if you don't want to have to move them, just hide them using that. Also, kind of related to this is if you do want to see something in here, let's say something like a node. Let's say we're in here and we keyframe this node. For whatever reason, we go forward a little bit, we keyframe it again. If we want to see these keyframes in Dopesheet, if we go back to animation and we have view only selected, you'll notice that we don't see any things. But if we go back into the compositing, if we select the node while the node itself is selected, you will see the keyframes in the Dopesheet. So if you're ever in the Dopesheet and you're wondering, why do I keep seeing these things? Just go check like your nodes and your compositing. You maybe have something selected, just unselect everything, and now it's no longer there. Another useful tip for the Dopesheet is that if you hold Control and right click, it will select all keyframes before or after your cursor, depending on where you click. So if I go right here and hold Control and right click to the right, we'll select all the keyframes to the right. And if I hold Control and click on right click on the left, it will grab all the things on the left. And this is really useful if you say you're maybe like right here and you want to kind of extend the shot or something. You can just literally right click there and it'll grab all them, move everything over, and it'll move everything beyond that point to the side, which is very useful. And just like using objects, we can grab something like a bunch of keyframes, go to a moment and do Shift S, and we can move keyframes to a frame just as we did other stuff in the viewport. You can use Control L to link animation data. For example, let's say we have a bunch of these cubes. We want them all to disappear on frame, whatever frame I end up on, frame 14. So if I have the visibility and the render on, and I keyframe it to be off, and now we want to apply that to all these cubes, if you have this cube selected and then select all the other ones, do Control L and link the animation data. Now all these things have the animation now, they will all disappear at once. However, it's worth noting that now that they're linked, any changes to the original will affect all of them. So now they'll all disappear and they'll all come back on. But it's useful to save time if you just have a really simple thing you want to like toggle off. You can use page up and page down to move things around in the Dopesheet. For example, let's say that we want the root near the top. We want the pelvis to be kind of near the top because we're using the pelvis a lot. If we click on the pelvis, use page up. While hovering over this area, we can kind of shift things around. So we can kind of organize this if it kind of gets a little bit out of order. We can put things near the bottom that we're not really using. And just like in the viewport, we can focus in on certain keyframes if we select them. And by default, it's numpad period, I believe. I changed mine to F. Again, this is something I'll be talking about at the end of this tutorial. So if we, let's say, we just want to grab these head keyframes and move over them, it'll zoom in on them. So you can zoom way out, grab the bit you want, and zoom in on it. Much easier. You can do the same thing in the graph editor as well. Select a bunch of stuff, press F to zoom in. This is how I do pretty much all my graph editor work, and this is why I don't like having the, let me also go into filters, turn all these things off, and delete all the scale keyframes. Let's say I want to just change the head kind of X rotation. Just grab a bit, zoom in on it, grab a bit, zoom in on it. Again, I'm pressing the F key. Let me turn on the screencast keys again. But yours is probably something different if you haven't set it to it. And again, I'll be talking about the hotkeys at the end. But there you go, grab them, zoom in, Dopesheet, grab them, zoom in. Very useful. You can also use numpad 0 to get to where your cursor is. If your cursor is way over here, but you're kind of zoomed in, press numpad 0. It'll bring you over to where your cursor is, which is kind of handy if you're really zoomed in and kind of moves along and you want to kind of keep up to date to where this thing is. You can also use the home key to see where all the keyframes are. For example, if I import this character and I'm way over at frame 1600, and this character only has, keyframes on the first few hundred, if I go in the Dopesheet, press home, it will zoom straight to the beginning where all the keyframes are between the first 160. So I'm way over here again, home, zooms in on it nicely. You can also use clean keyframes, and I don't really do this too often. Let me try to put an example together real quick. So here we have a cube that kind of goes down, moves left and right for a little bit, and then it goes up and moves off. Well, for the most part, it's only really going down, and then it just starts going left and right a whole bunch. However, we have lots and lots of keyframes, even though something like the Z location is pretty much consistent for the whole thing. If I have a bunch of things selected and I press delete, rather than deleting keyframes, if you clean them, you see how it got rid of all those extra little keyframes in the middle, but then it still retains the overall motion. That's because those keyframes aren't really needed. You can grab a whole bunch of stuff, hit delete, do clean keyframes, has the exact same animation stuff, but now there's not nearly as many keyframes. Again, helps with optimization, helps keep your scene performance better. However, I would be a little careful about this. I would only really use this if you need to. I've had cases where it didn't really seem like it worked out quite right. You can also do clean channels, which seems to work out even less often. But you see what that did. I didn't have any rotations on the cube at all. So because there was nothing even being rotated, it just completely got rid of them. Again, I would use both of those with caution, but if you do have a problem with just a bunch of these kind of similar things, I would definitely try it out, make sure it still looks alright, and then it might be able to give you some more performance. The next thing I want to do is just show some general advice on the graph editor, just how to kind of navigate it a bit. I find a lot of people kind of neglect the graph editor just because it's kind of messy and hard to use, but it's actually one of the most useful things, I think, for getting a lot of animation stuff. So let's say I have the head of this character who's walking along, and I want to just kind of tweak some stuff. Well, first of all, what I usually do, if we have, show only selected, and turn on the ghosting, and, turn all the other stuff off. But if I have the head selected, by default I'll have a bunch of this stuff, and it's just, people see it, they see a big mess, they don't really know what to do. So here's what I would recommend. You can ignore the graph editor at first, but when you're ready to start using it, step one is grab the thing you want. You can click and drag across all the eyeballs to hide everything, and just go one at a time. Let's grab the X rotation, that's this rotation. So we're going to grab just that, And if I press A to select everything, press F to zoom in, or in your case it might be numpad period. Again, the hotkey stuff, which I'll get to at the end. But if we zoom in on this, it's literally that easy. Just box select what you want, zoom in. Box select what you want, zoom in. It's literally not that hard to zoom in and out and navigate. If you hold control and middle mouse click and drag, you can kind of change the sizing and stuff. Another tip is, let's say we have a few of these things on. If we press this normalize key, it will bring everything up to like a 0 and 1. So if I take any of these things and make it higher, it will kind of normalize everything. It'll keep all this stuff within this 0 and 1. That way you're not having to constantly zoom like way out for the location and way back in. As you see right here, if I have everything shown and unnormalized, we have some stuff like way up here and some things way down there. Have normalize on, everything gets constrained into the -1 to 1. So normalize is handy. Box select, zoom in, grab things, move things around. You can also press O to do soft selection. So now if I grab this, and while I'm dragging it around, if I start scrolling, you'll see a little circle around here. It starts getting bigger, and as it gets bigger, you can move around kind of stuff in general. So if you have like a walk cycle and then you want to kind of slowly look down for a bit, you know, just have some soft select, bring it down. So now it kind of gradually looks down, gradually looks back up. There are also 3 different pivot points we can use for in here. The default is, of course, the box select, which means if I want to scale these, it will scale everything around the middle. I can kind of constrain that to go scale Y, do around the Y, but it's still scaling right around the center point. I can change that to something like the cursor. Now I can move the cursor and it will scale around, you know, where the cursor is, which is useful if you want to kind of leave one alone, but then scale the other side. Everything still rotates around wherever your point is. Or you can use the individual centers. It's sometimes useful if you just want to kind of scale things to make them sharper or tighter. If you want to rotate things and get some kind of weird results, this is pretty useful if you want to kind of tweak a bunch of things. And the other one is useful in certain cases if you want to kind of, I use it for scaling around a certain point. You can also use linear extrapolation if you have something that you just want to kind of move forever in one direction. Let's say you have a starting point, an ending point, and if we have all the keyframes selected in the graph editor, and we press Shift E, do linear extrapolation, and now it'll just keep moving in that direction forever. And even if you have some kind of weird animation in the middle, you can still do Shift E, linear extrapolation, and it'll just extrapolate the endpoints. So it will, so it'll kind of come in forever, then it'll do its thing you did, then it'll just go away using the last thing forever. However, if you wanted to repeat a certain process a little over and over, let me show you some of the useful modifiers. So one of the most useful modifiers for me is the noise modifier. If I have something like the cube, go into maybe the Z location, just make this a little bigger, press N to bring open the menu, modifiers, add modifier, noise. Many of you probably know this one, just add some noise. You can play around with, you know, what the frequency of the noise is. Now the frequency is really low, or you can make really high frequency noise. You can even see it reflected in here. This is where the normalize is really handy. And of course you can add it to different values, so you can have things rotating with noise, and then you can have things rotating around different points with noise. Another useful modifier is the built-in function. Pretty much just use the sine wave, set it to additive, and let's lower the phase a lot. You can make something so that it just continuously, you know, does some kind of back and forth thing over and over, and you can kind of offset it a little bit. It's useful in certain cases. And the last modifier that's pretty useful is the cycles one. If we have something like this cube that just kind of does this pattern that goes up, goes back, and as long as it kind of starts and ends at the same spot, and in this case I'm just keeping it simple, it's just moving along the Z. If I grab that Z, go to add modifier, cycles, now you'll see that it will repeat forever. And it's smart enough where it kind of knows where it starts and ends and just continuously repeats. And this is pretty handy. Now you can make any changes to it, and now it'll affect everything. The only thing that's a little tedious is, in this case, it's just going up and doing that. If we also wanted it to do something, let's say it goes up, and we want to scale down a bunch, so go to like 0.4. Now, we would have to do this again on all 3 scales. We'd have to go into scales, do cycles, Y scale, cycles, and Z, cycles, but you can still get a nice thing that kind of loops and loops, and if you just want something in the background that's just kind of doing some simple looking thing, the cycles can be very handy. Alright, moving on to things like nodes and materials. I'm going to bring up the node editor real quick. One of the biggest tips I would have for using nodes and stuff is to enable Node Wrangler and get to know just the basics of it. And what I mean is if you go into File, User Preferences, Add-ons, if you search for Node Wrangler, it comes with Blender. You just need to enable it. Mine's enabled. Make sure you hit Save User Settings. You might need to restart Blender. But once Node Wrangler is on, let's say I have something like these nodes. Get rid of that node here real quick. Let's say I wanted to select these two, or sorry, connect these two. Normally you'd go, okay, let's click on the yellow dot and let's let go, and there we go, we connected them. With Node Wrangler, you can hold down Control, and if you right click on something and drag, and if you let go on another node, it will automatically connect the ones that it thinks are most similar. And where this is super useful is something like the grass, these grass nodes that you have to make all these things for. Let me show you just how easy it is to do using this quick way versus the old way. Let's say I wanted to add an add node here and add some translucency. So we'd add, go to translucent, and we go whoop, and we go whoop. So that's how it was initially, but with the Node Wrangler, watch how much quicker it's going to be. We go to our add, go to our translucency, we go bip, bam, done. That easy. Literally, like, it saves you a whole lot of time. And my next tip is how to get these straight wires rather than the wires being all kind of curvy. I found the curvy ones were just kind of hard to tell what was going where. This way it goes exactly to it, so it's easier to follow. That's actually under your themes of all things. If you're in themes, you go to Node Editor, change the noodle curving to 0, and then save the user settings. That will make all your noodles straight. Next up, in compositing, I'm going to show you a little bit about just the viewer node. This is probably one you're familiar with, but I figured I'd just explain it a little bit anyway, just in case not, because the viewer node is extremely handy. So if let's say I'm rendering something out, I'm rendering a little frame from this animation, and while that's going, the thing you want on is the backdrop. So if you have backdrop enabled in here, and let me get rid of the viewer node, let me get rid of all that and just kind of move this down. So if we don't have a viewer node, we don't see the backdrop at all. There's no backdrop, even if I turn backdrop on and off. But if I add a viewer node and select it at the end, now you'll see the viewer node will show us what's going on in the background. I don't know why it's off-centered. That's kind of weird. I must have moved it for some reason. Kind of put that back where it was. But the reason the viewer node's handy is if you hold Control and Shift and left-click on different nodes, you can see what those nodes look like. And this is extremely handy for previewing your compositing stuff. Let's say you want to go in here and see what this node looks like. You know, we can go in here now, we can do tweaks to it, and we can really see exactly what everything looks like. And then we can use that to kind of preview what these different things will look like. Of course, you can find this obviously looks really bad because I made it really bad, but a very useful thing to moving the viewer node around. You can use M to mute different nodes. Let's say we just kind of want to temporarily mute all the boosh stuff here. Grab all that and press M. You'll see it'll just mute them, so it'll go right past them. I don't know why this scene looks really bad. This is a really nasty render. I think the sky disappeared or something. Not sure what went wrong here. Doesn't matter. But you can use M to mute different things. And if you use H, you can hide them, which just kind of minimizes things. Doesn't really get rid of it. It just makes it a little easier to see. You can hold Control and left click to drag and cut if you want to cut across some different cables all at once. Really good for just kind of mass cutting a whole bunch of stuff off. Or if you hold down Shift and left click and drag, it will connect the cables together into a reroute, which is nice if you want to just have one thing reroute at the end. Then you want to add in like a color correction here, add some curves. You don't have to just connect both of them now, as it goes right into the reroute, and I can do your color correction. You can also drag and drop colors when you're in the node editor, or any of the node kind of stuff. Let's say we have a color here that we really like, and we have another color elsewhere. That's another one, and we say, oh, I want that blue to be down here. You can literally click on the blue and drop it somewhere else. I don't really find that too useful, but it's nice that it exists if you ever do want to move it around. It might be more useful in material nodes, not so much compositing. And you can turn off the node shifting stuff with this button down here. Let's say I want to add a mix node, You know, see how it kind of pushes everything over. Sometimes you have some big thing like this, and you want to add a node. Like, let's say sometimes you're like me and you have things like vertical for some reason, and then you want to add a node in here. But by doing so, it pushes everything over. If you don't want that, just turn off that with that button there. And that is the end of all my tips, except for the hotkey thing. So let's jump into the hotkey thing now, because I kind of skimmed over that at the beginning. And I'll show you some of the stuff I've done and how I've exactly changed it and how to best make use of it yourself. So one of the main ones I've done is if I press F, it zooms into my object. By default, that was numpad period, I believe. But numpad period is just really hard to click, whereas the F key is right next to, you know, your WASD. If you're zooming around, you zoom around and press F to zoom in on it. But let me show you how I did that. So if I go to File, User Preferences, go into Input, and I want to go to, I believe this one was under 3D View? 3D View Global? Yeah. The view selected, yeah, you can see it was, it's Control Numpad. That's really awkward. But you can literally just add a new one, or you can click on it and change it to something else you want. So I clicked on it, I set it to F, I hit Save User Settings, now I press F to zoom in. Let me just show you one thing that will probably come up if you start setting up your user preferences like this and setting up your input. For example, I had the F that zooms in on things. If you go into here and then you change, you know, the 3D view, was object mode, if you do the zoom in thing to be F as well, like I did, you'll notice it'll work in the viewport. If I press tab and go into edit mode, you'll notice that if I press F, it won't actually zoom in. In my case it does because I fixed it. Let me show you how I fix it. The reason it doesn't is because there's a conflict with another key binding. And what I do is I go into, at the top, it'll be sorted by name. If you sort by key binding and type in F, you'll see everything else that uses F. And again, I've already changed mine, but somewhere under 3D mode or 3D view or edit mode, there's an option for F to create a face. You can just click on that and do like Shift F or Control F, change it to something else, and then save it. And now you'll be able to zoom in both edit mode and global mode. And finally, let me just show you some of the last ones I had done. So I did F there. I did F in the graph editor as I showed you earlier, and the Dopesheet. So if I grab all these things, I have F as well. F is one of the main ones I do. I just changed almost all my zooms to F rather than numpad period. But the other one I found that was very, very useful, and this is kind of more specific to me, might not be as useful to you, but if I use the up and down keyframe, you know, up and down arrows to jump between these keyframes, but the arrow keys are all the way across my keyboard, and I use that a whole lot to get between keyframes. So what I did, I changed that to my mouse 4 and 5 buttons, the ones on the side of my mouse, kind of forward and back buttons, so I can use that to quickly jump between the keyframes without even having to lift my hand off the keyboard. And then I changed my left and right, which usually just goes forward and backwards, you know, a single frame. I changed the left and right to also work for Q and E, which is right next to my W. So with those two combined, I can use Q and E to step through these frames, you know, make a slight adjustment, go forward, make an adjustment, kind of step through the frames. I can use the mouse to skip between keyframes. And with the Q, E, and mouse 4 and 5, I can really, really like fine-tune navigate stuff much, much easier. And again, that is under, for me, I think I had to go under user preferences. I'll look for key bindings. My Q. I had to actually make one for this. I had to actually do a little Googling for this. I had to search up like how to do, I had to create like an add new, type out the screen not frame offset by -1 and +1. I had to do a little bit of stuff to make this one work, but I would definitely Google it, do some interesting research. It sounds kind of weird to say. Do some research on it because it's an interesting thing that can save you a whole lot of work, or save you a whole lot of productivity in Blender. And that is it, I believe. This is my whole thing I just finished going through. I just went through all of these tips I had. My cheeks actually hurt from talking for so long, so I'm going to end it about there. Thank you anyone who listened and watched the whole thing. Sorry this was kind of messy. Sorry it was kind of quickly put together. Sorry I kind of sound like I'm kind of getting tired and losing my voice. But again, it was something I just really wanted to get out now. I'll probably honestly make another one of these once Blender 2.8 comes out, but like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, you know, I've been waiting around for it, and it's, you know, months and months later, and it just keeps getting pushed back and getting pushed back. So I figured, let's just make this tutorial now. Hopefully it'll help you now, and when 2.8 comes out, I can make another one. So if you have any of your own tips you think would be really helpful I didn't cover in this video, let me know in the comments below, and maybe when I remake this tutorial in 2.8, I can show your tips as well. Sorry if I went a little fast. I should have mentioned in the beginning, I realized I didn't mention in the beginning, but I should have mentioned this isn't really for just total beginners. This is for people who have been using Blender. You know what I'm talking about when I mention things like lock rot. You know what auto keyframe is. This is for people who've been using Blender for a while and just wanted to kind of learn some new things and learn some stuff that would speed up productivity. I also wanted to get this video out because of the hiring animators video that we just released on our community channel. We just made this video about I'm hiring animators for Songs of War, and I thought, you know, what a perfect time to make a video giving people some general advice and tips in Blender for those people who might be interested in joining the team for Songs of War. This could absolutely help you out. Maybe it could be the difference of whether you enjoy animating or not if you found that animating was too awkward to use, but now it's much easier. As my final kind of advice, again, it's just a lot of it is just learning this Dopesheet and graph editor, being able to quickly, you know, go in here and like polish things up, having it set to normalize if you want to really like push everything together and see everything. And it's just a matter of just doing it, using it, practicing it, finding out what works best for you. These tips might not be what's best for you, which is of course why I mentioned the hotkey one, and I mentioned just kind of doing whatever hotkeys you find yourself using a lot, because I use, you know, I use the arrow key stuff a lot, so for me it made sense having my Q and E be frames and having my mouse 4 and 5 be the keyframes. So that's it. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you made it to the end, please let me know. I'm curious to see if anyone made it through this whole hour-long video or however long it's ended up being. I hope these things helped. Let me know how many of these things helped. If you knew all this stuff, or if there were a lot of new things in here you didn't know about. Let me know if you think that these tips are actually going to help you animate a little better. It would be reassuring for me to know that some of these tips and tricks will actually lead you to being better at animating, or at least animating more easily or quicker. So thanks, and I will see you next tutorial. Goodbye. You can use Shift while you're dragging to cut things. Sorry. You can use... You can use Control while you're dragging your mouse with right click and Control to... Sorry. What? You can hold Control and left click to drag and cut if you want to cut across some different cables all at once.